worked with back on our install Hyper-V NUG, where we brought to life two Hyper-V hosts, HV1 NUG and HV2 NUG, by installing the Hyper-V role onto them. We also installed the management tools so we could remotely manage both of these hosts on our client administration machine, Admin NUG. Now, the only thing I did in between these labs was add a VM on each one of our Hyper-V hosts. So on HV1 NUG, we have a VM called GUI NUG, and on HV2 NUG, we have a VM called Core NUG. So we're going to remotely manage both the hosts as well as the VMs on both of those hosts entirely from Admin NUG. So that's where we're going to start out. Let's go ahead and log in to our administration machine. So we're going to start on Admin NUG here by just taking a quick peek at both of our hosts and the VMs on them through Hyper-V Manager. And let's get there the quick and easy way here. Let's right-click on the Start button, head up to Run, and type in virtmgmt.msc. That'll launch us right in to the Hyper-V Manager administration console. And here it is. So here's HV1 NUG, and here's HV2 NUG. Notice HV1 NUG has GUI NUG on it. HV2 NUG has Core NUG. Both of these are currently in an off state, and we'll be using PowerShell here to turn them on, get onto them, and remotely manage them. All right, so there's the setup. Let's go ahead and minimize Hyper-V Manager. We'll be back to that later. And let's launch the ISE, the Integrated Scripting Environment, by giving the PowerShell icon on the taskbar a right-click, and we need to launch this as an administrator. Choose Yes here at the User Account Control dialog, and that'll launch us right in to the ISE. From here, let's go ahead and close out of our default PowerShell script. Hit that Open button on the toolbar, which should plant you right into the Nugget Lab directory, and let's open up pscommands.ps1. The first thing I want to point out here is you can find all of the Hyper-V commandlets inside of the Hyper-V module. So you can run a git command targeting that module, and this will give us a big list of all those commandlets. We can use these to manage our hosts as well as the VMs on them and all of the components in between, such as networking and storage. And we'll be looking at all of the popular ones here throughout our Hyper-V section. So I'm going to go ahead and Control-R to head back to the script pane here. And the first thing we're going to look at is how to remotely manage our hosts themselves. We have three ways that we can create remote sessions against our Hyper-V hosts using PowerShell. Now, all of these rely on PowerShell remoting, which again is enabled by default in Server 2016. If for whatever reason it became disabled, you can run an enable PS remoting, or you can utilize WinRM directly using a WinRM quick config to get it re-enabled. So we have three flavors of remote sessions. We have single-use remote sessions. This is where we use invoke command to just simply send a command over to the machine. It's going to start the session, fire the command, and then close the session. We also have interactive sessions. We can use enter PS session to enter into a session. As long as we're on that session, it's active, we're in it. When we leave that session, it will automatically close out. And then finally, we have persistent sessions. This is where we use new PS session to create a session that we can then reconnect to if we were to ever disconnect. Let's begin with our single-use remote session command, invoke command. So let's say that we just wanted to get some information about both of our hosts. We can run an invoke command, target both of those hosts, HV1 NUG and HV2 NUG, and then our script block specify the command that we want to run. We'll run get VM host here, and if we execute this, it's just going to open that session, run that command on both of those machines simultaneously, and return us the results. And there it is, just a quick high-level look with the default properties from both of these VM host objects. We can see both hosts have 2 logical CPUs and 8 gigs of memory. We could drill in a little deeper here if I Control-R back to the script pane, and we could pipe this to a format list and throw an asterisk in. This means get us all of the properties on both of these hosts. Now, if we execute it, we're going to get a big list containing all of these properties, and we'll get some more information around these machines. So here's HV2 NUG, and if we scroll up a little bit, we will see HV1 NUG's settings. We can still see our logical processor count and our memory capacity. We can also see our MAC address, min and max, if enhanced session mode is enabled, and also our default paths for VHDs and VM settings. We can change a lot of this stuff using set VM host. In fact, let's do that here. I'm going to go ahead and go split screen here, and let's run another invoke command specifying both of those machines, and let's run set VM host, set our virtual hard disk path to the VMs directory over on the V drive, and same with the virtual machine path. That way they're all in one consistent area. In fact, when I created both of those VMs, I specified this directory in the wizard, which changes both of those on the fly. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's run this command. It'll fire that off on both hosts and change that default location. And while that's going on, we can actually head down to the GUI and verify that worked. You can change a lot of these settings using Hyper-V Manager as well. If you right-click on your host and choose Hyper-V settings, check it out. See that? Now, these have been changed. And if we were to rerun a get VM host, we could see that through PowerShell as well. Let's head back to the ISE. So those are single-use remote sessions because we're still on our administrative machine here, admin.nug. We never really got onto those machines. We just sent commands over to them, and they were ran on the local machine, and their results were turned back here to admin.nug. Next up, we can use enter PS session to get into an interactive session. We've used this in the past many times as well, but this will put us on to that machine inside of a PowerShell session that will last as long as we're in that session. Let's run an enter PS session against HV1nug. Give that a second, and it'll put us right onto that machine. Now we can start executing commands as if we were physically on that machine. If we run a get VM here, this will list all of the virtual machines running on that Hyper-V host, and we only have one, and it's GUI-nug, and it's currently in an off state. Let's fire it up here. We can run a start VM, pass in the name of our VM here as GUI-nug, and this will fire it up. Our VM is on. Now if we run a get VM one more time here, this time it'll show our state as running. And we can verify that as well by going back into the GUI, Hyper-V Manager, clicking on HV1nug, and there's GUI-nug in a running state, and then there's the thumbnail of what it currently looks like. Now we can close our remote session down with an exit PS session. Now it's gone. And we can see down here in our result pane that we're back on our local machine. So an interactive session only lasts for as long as you are in the session. We can also create a persistent remote connection. Here's where we use new PS session, and we're going to store this into a variable so we can use it later. But if we execute this line of code, we're going to create a remote session against HV2nug, which is our nano server Hyper-V host. And now it's not going to put us onto that session, but it did create it. In fact, down here, if we run a get PS session, we'll be able to see that we have one session. Notice our interactive session is gone, but we have one persistent connection over to that machine. So we could hook into this at any time using an enter PS session and use the session parameter, passing in our variable that contains that session, and this will physically get us onto this machine. Let's take a look at the VMs that we have on this host. We have one, and it is CoreNug, and it's currently in an off state. Let's also fire this one up, so we'll have both of our machines on both of our hosts running. There we go. Now, if we want to get VM again, we should see that it's in a running state. And now let's exit out of this session, only this time it's not going to close that session. That session is still active because if we run a get PS session, there it is, still an active session, and we could still hook into it at any time. So those are the three ways that we can use PowerShell remoting to create sessions against our remote machines. Now, here's the thing. All of these use the computer name parameter. So we needed a networking layer to actually hook in to those machines, and we'll need that anyway for our host machines. But what about the VMs on those hosts? Let's take a look at Powershell Direct. This is a great brand new feature here in Hyper-V and PowerShell that allows us to, as long as we're on our Hyper-V host, get right into a session on those machines without needing a network layer at all. It goes through the VM bus layer of our host machines. And you can see the big difference here. We can still use those three methods of getting onto those machines, but we use the VM name, and there's also a VM ID parameter to utilize PowerShell Direct to get into those machines. Now, this first command here, invoke command, if we were to run this right now from our remote machine here, admin.nug, would we be able to tap into that CoreNug machine? No, because we're not on our host, which is HV2nug. So this would fail right now. It wouldn't be able to find CoreNug because it's not hosted on this local machine. So what we're going to use is that variable that we just created previously, which has a persistent session HV2nug. And when we're on that machine through PowerShell remoting, then we'll use PowerShell Direct on the host to get into that machine. And you actually get to see this in the result pane. It's kind of cool to look at. So first, let's do an enter PS session, and let's reuse that variable that we created above, pass that into the session parameter here. And the name of that variable was $HV2. This will get us right back onto HVnug. Now we should be able to run this command right here, invoke command. Pass in the VM name of CoreNug, which is a VM hosted on HVnug2. We're also going to need the credential parameter because this machine doesn't have a networking layer. It's not a member of the domain, so we're going to need to pass in local credentials. And we'll just toss a get computer info over to that machine. So I'm going to go ahead and execute that command, and it's going to ask us here for our credentials. Let's pop those in. Administrator, not Tayor. There we go. And standard lab password that we've been using. And there's all those details about our CoreNug machine, all kinds of good information in here about that. But again, we just threw a command over to that machine. We can also do an interactive session here. I'm still scrolling up. There it is. There's CoreNug. There is the Windows Edition. This is server data center. It's a server core installation, so on and so forth. So let's head back down here. And now let's enter into an interactive session on our CoreNug machine using PowerShell Direct. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. It's going to ask for our credentials once again here. And check it out. Here's what I was talking about earlier here. Notice that we can tell that we're 2 levels deep. We're PowerShell remoted onto our HV2nug Hyper-V host, and then we're PowerShell directed into a VM on that host. So we can see that visually here in the results. Now we can start executing commands against our CoreNug machine. We can run a get Windows feature, for instance, to see what we have as far as roles and features go on this machine. There they are. And I also want to point out here, if we run an IP config with the all switch, we're not going to get anything back because we don't actually we have an adapter attached to the machine, but it's not attached to any network. So you can see running that, we didn't get any IP information, nothing. So this is one of the big benefits of PowerShell Direct is we don't need a networking layer at all. We can get right onto those machines, and this will help big time, especially if you have networking issues. Prior to PowerShell Direct, we had to have networking working before we could get onto these machines. Now we can get onto them without it. All right, let's get off of our core NUG machine here, and out of our interactive session, we can run an exit PS session, and now we're back on our Hyper-V host HV2 NUG. We can also create persistent PowerShell Direct sessions, just like we did there with PowerShell remoting. Again, the key here is just simply the VM name parameter. Computer name goes through the networking layer, VM name goes underneath it. So let's create a persistent PowerShell Direct session here using the new PS session and the VM name parameter over to core NUG. This will also ask us for credentials here on that machine. We'll go ahead and pass them in. And I passed in the wrong credentials. Let me try that again. There we go. And again, that didn't put us on to the core NUG machine. That just created a session, because if we run a get PS session down here on our HV2 NUG machine, we should see that session is there and it's open and we could connect to it at any time. Let's do just that. Let's run an enter PS session and pass in our variable here. And now we'll be back onto our core NUG machine. Cool. Notice again here, we are on core NUG. Now let's create a file over on this machine. I want to show you a couple of other cool things we can do here with PowerShell Direct. There we go. And now let's exit out of this session. So before we do that here, let me run a dir just to prove that we have that file. Oh, we need to cd back to the root here because we placed it in the root. Dir. And there it is. There's corenug.txt. All right, let's exit out of that session now. And now we're back on to HV2 NUG. All right, let's scroll down a little bit here because the copy item commandlet has two parameters. These are great. And I showed you these earlier as well, but these are just fantastic because what we can do is use our sessions to copy files to and from VMs. And by the way, this is not restricted to just PowerShell Direct. These parameters work with any sessions using either PowerShell remoting or PowerShell Direct. So let's, on our local HV2 NUG machine, create another file here. All right, so now we have a file in the root of HV2 NUG. If I run a dir here, we can see it. There it is, hv2nug.txt. And over on our core NUG VM, we have corenug.txt. So our goal here is to get both of those files on both machines. What we can do is use that session that we just created to take this file and send it over to our core NUG machine without ever needing to get on it. So the copy item parameter here, the path is for your local file, destination is where it's going on that remote machine, and the session is what you want to use to transport it over. So we're going to pass in our core session there, and if we execute that line, it's going to take that local file and send it over. And now we could do the same thing. Say we have a file over there on core NUG that we want to bring over here to our local machine. We can do a from session. This will take the file reference here through the path directory on that remote machine and copy it here locally as the destination on this machine. So also run this line of code. And now if we run a dir on this machine, we should see both files. And if we head back over there to core NUG, both files will exist there as well. I can't even begin to tell you how awesome the addition of these two parameters are to the copy item commandlet. It just makes everything so much easier when you want to copy files to and from remote machines or even VMs. Now, it's also good practice to clean up our remote persistent sessions when we're done with them, and we can use a remove PS session to do so. If we have access to that variable, we can use that variable to remove it, or if you don't have access to that variable and that session is still out there, you can run a get PS session. There it is. We're on HV2 NUG. There's our session to core NUG. I'm going to recall my last command and just pipe the results of that, which is just this one here, to remove PS session, just like so. Now it's gone. Now, if we run a get PS session again, we should see there's no more sessions from HV2 NUG to core NUG. Now let's get out of our session on HV2 NUG and also close that session. So we're going to run an exit PS session here. That'll get us back onto our admin NUG machine here. And now we can remove the session referencing that variable, and it's gone. So make sure you're comfortable with these three kinds of PowerShell sessions. They're incredible, and they allow you to do stuff like this. Remote into your hosts, and then remote into the VMs on that host without ever needing to leave your workstation. All right, moving on. Let's talk about nested virtualization, another brand new feature here in Server 2016. And this is great. And actually, this is what makes labs possible for our Hyper-V section here in Server 2016. The reason that we were able to install Hyper-V, the role, on both HV1 and HV2 NUG is because I enabled it at the host level in our lab provider. If we didn't have nested virtualization, I would have had to use extreme measures to get this to work like I did back in 70-410. But it was all so much easier here in Server 2016. Nested virtualization allows us to turn a VM into a Hyper-V host. And we do that by exposing the virtualization extensions of the host to the VM or VMs underneath it. First, let's see what life is like without nested virtualization. I'm going to clear my screen down here. And now let's enter a PS session over onto our HV1 NUG machine. All right, so we're in a remote session on that machine. I'll navigate back to the root here. There we go. And let's just fire an invoke command over to GUI NUG. Let's say we wanted to turn the VM GUI NUG into a Hyper-V host. So we'll run an invoke command and say install Windows feature, Hyper-V, and include the management tools onto that machine. It's going to try it. Oh, we got to pass our credentials in here. There we go. But eventually, it's going to come back with an error message saying, sorry, that VM does not support virtualization. There it is. The processor does not have required virtualization capabilities. We'll get the same exact results through the GUI. In fact, if we head back to Hyper-V Manager, I'm going to right-click on GUI NUG, and let's connect to it using Virtual Machine Connect here. Here we go. Here's our Virtual Machine connection. And if we were to log into this machine and run through the Add Roles and Features wizard in Server Manager, we will get a very similar result. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-Delete here, and we're just going to log in with our standard lab password. I'm going to hit the View menu here and go full screen mode. Server Manager should launch automatically for us there. And once it's done collecting inventory, let that progress bar finish up. Cool. We can drop down the Manage menu, choose Add Roles and Features, hit Next a few times until you get to Server Roles, and choose Hyper-V. Hit Add Features, and sorry, can't do it because our processor doesn't have the required virtualization capabilities. So what we need to do to make this work is just a very simple one-liner in PowerShell to expose the virtualization extensions again to this VM. And you will need your VM to be in an off state. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of our VM Connect window here, head back into our ISE session, and I'm just going to run a stop VM against GUI NUG. This will shut that VM down. Cool, and we can just verify that in Hyper-V Manager here, GUI NUG is in an off state. So now, here is that one-liner. Set VM processor. We'll specify our VM name and the exposed virtualization extensions parameter. Set that to true. That's it. Nested virtualization is enabled. Now we can restart the VM. All right, it's on. And if we scroll down a little bit, and we're already in an interactive session, so you can actually completely ignore this line. I'll get that out of there. But now all we need to do is rerun and install Windows feature specifying the Hyper-V role. We'll include the management tools there, but this time it'll work. Success. And now after a reboot, we would be able to create VMs on our VM. Yeah, Hyper-V hosts within Hyper-V hosts. That's what nested virtualization is all about. Now, the last thing I want to show you is how we can delegate administration of our Hyper-V hosts and the VMs on them to our trusted IT staff. So they can do what we're doing here, remotely manage our hosts and the VMs on them without giving them access to the physical host itself, right? We don't want them to get onto the host and actually have access to the operating system, but we still want to allow them to use tools like Hyper-V Manager and PowerShell to start and stop VMs, configure VMs, as well as the host. And it's fairly simple. When you install the Hyper-V role on a host machine, it is going to plan in a Hyper-V administrators group on that local machine. In fact, if we right-click on the Start button and bring up Computer Management, and we'll just give that a maximize, and let's right-click on Computer Management, and let's connect to another machine. Let's connect over to HV1 NUG. We could also do this against our nano server, HV2 NUG. But if we drop down System Tools and drop down Local Users and Groups and choose Groups, you're going to see there's a Hyper-V administrators group. Again, this was installed when we added the Hyper-V role to this machine. If we open this up and hit Add, we can browse Active Directory and add any of those IT folks that we trust to manage our Hyper-V hosts. Doing this will give them all the power they need to manage the host and the VM through Hyper-V Manager as well as PowerShell. Now, in the past, if we wanted to assign granular permission sets to specific individuals, maybe we only wanted somebody to have the ability to start a VM, somebody else the ability to create and stop VMs, we had a tool called Authorization Manager, ASMAN for short. That tool was deprecated back in Server 2012. It's still here in Server 2016, but it's going away, so don't rely on it. Microsoft recommends, if you want to get granular with your permission sets, to use System Center Virtual Machine Manager. That's SCVMM. So keep that one in mind for the real world. For exam purposes, again, just know that this local Hyper-V administrators group is added to your host when you install the Hyper-V role, and it gives anybody that's a member of that group unrestricted access to all the features